So, thank you for coming. My name is Myles Smith. I'm from Internews. I was told that we start here on time. So we are going to start on time, and I also noticed that everybody here likes to use their phones. So while you're in this presentation, there will be opportunities to use your phone, which will be condoned by the panel. So we do want to know where you guys are coming from. So if you enter the address here into your phone, you'll come to a live poll where we'll be able to find out where everybody's from. While I'm doing that, I'm going to introduce all of us. So I'm Myles Smith. I'm the Senior Director at Internews. Internews is a media development organization. We're one of the largest in the world. We have projects in about 60 countries, among them Myanmar, which we'll talk a lot about today. I myself oversee our programs in the United States, as well as work on programs pretty much on every continent. We have a European branch based in London, and we're headquartered in California, though I am based in Washington. To my right, we have Rafiq Copeland. Rafiq, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I also work for Internews. I am based in Myanmar, and I manage a couple of different projects that we do there that work around issues of religious and ethnic diversity, which is a pretty big issue in the country at the moment. And I also work on our humanitarian programming.
To Rafiq's right, we have Margaret.
Hi everyone, I'm Margaret Coker. I am the managing editor at Coda Story, in charge of our disinformation channel. Coda Story is a nonprofit news organization. We focus very deeply on two major themes: disinformation and also authoritarian tech, how authoritarian governments use technology not to the benefit of their citizens.
And to Margaret's right, we have Emma.
Hi, I'm Emma Goodman. I work for the London School of Economics. So I work with academics who teach and research in media and communications, and I help them to have more impact outside academia. So among civil society, policymakers, and the general public.
Okay, and so what's going to happen is we're going to hear a little story. We tried to think about whether it was a success story, and then I think we kind of decided together that it's just a not terrible story about...
It's pretty terrible in places.
Well, it's terrible, but the result is better than we've seen in many circumstances on trying to get accountability for social networks, for the content that is hosted there. So Rafiq's going to tell a bit of a story from his experience from Myanmar, and our two fellow panelists will give a little bit of a response. Just looking up at the board, seeing a lot of folks from Eastern Europe, Turkey, and me from the United States. So you'll have a chance to keep filling these in. Also now on your phone you'll see a question about what profession you are in currently. So if you are a practicing journalist or a student or from a philanthropic organization, please let us know because it'll help us better respond to your questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over.
Myles, you promised not to sell their data on to a third party, right?
I do promise not to sell your data to a third party. But if I were a journalism organization, I wouldn't know how to make any money on it. So I'm not going to do that either. So Rafiq, why don't you take it from there?
Great. So I'm just going to do a bit of a deep dive on Myanmar for about 15 minutes. Myles is going to keep me honest on the time because I have a habit of talking a lot. It's a subject that I'm close to. And yeah, looking specifically at how Facebook was weaponized in that country and then moving on towards a little bit of the kind of accountability that's happened around that. So to start off with, this is a picture that was on Facebook in Myanmar in 2012. It was a woman who was raped and killed by some Muslim men in Rakhine State. I've blurred the picture here. It was incredibly graphic. And that incident contributed to an outbreak of intercommunal violence, which resulted in 140,000 people being displaced from their homes. And that displaced population is still living in IDP camps in Rakhine today. In 2012, the number of people that were on Facebook in Myanmar or were on the internet in Myanmar was very small. So I don't think that we can attribute the violence to the internet, but it was certainly circulated widely, and a lot of people did see the picture that way. When we talk about people that were on the internet at that stage, so this is a chart from the Q3 of 2014 to Q1 of 2017, so 2.5 years. Connectivity in the country went from less than 5% of the people having SIM cards to more than 100%. A great deal of those phones, the first phones that people ever had, were smartphones, and they came preloaded with Facebook. So, you know, we talk a lot about how Facebook is the internet in Myanmar. It's become a bit of a cliche, but it's effectively true. And it's become a little bit of a feedback loop because so much of the internet activity in the country is on Facebook. It means that most of the Burmese language content on the internet is on Facebook. So as soon as you get outside of Facebook, if you're a Burmese speaker, there just isn't much to look at. So thinking specifically about weaponization. So you saw that graph from late 2014 to 2017. This is a picture there of Uwaratu, who is the leader of Mabata, which is a Buddhist nationalist network in Myanmar. He's been referred to as the Buddhist bin Laden, which is perhaps a little bit dramatic, but gets the point across. He's an extremist and holds very extreme views. And the picture there on the right is from social media training workshops that Mabata started conducting in 2015. So the Buddhist nationalists were very active, early adopters on Facebook, learnt to use it very well, and actually have connections with networks in other countries, including Sri Lanka, where they did social media training for Buddhist nationalist groups in those countries too. When we talk about weaponization, I think in Myanmar we see a sort of full suite of different types of weaponizations that we get in a lot of other countries. Perhaps not the full suite, there's a lot of different sorts. But definitely hate speech, death threats, doxing and targeting of activists and journalists. This picture here is of a Muslim journalist who was, his personal information was published on Facebook and there were death threats against him. The content was reported to Facebook, and I don't know if you can see, but the picture on the right shows that Facebook said that it didn't violate their rules. And there was so much danger amongst the community that knew this journalist, and these death threats and his personal information was circulated so widely that there was actually a campaign. It was reported so many times, and Facebook kept saying that it didn't violate the standards. There's actually a campaign from international journalists on Twitter to try and get Facebook to remove the content that threatened him, which they eventually did do following public pressure. But that's just one example of the type of thing that was happening on Facebook over 2015 and 2016 in particular. So fast forwarding a bit, this is 2017 in September. A lot of you are probably familiar with this in broad terms. So there was an attack by a group in Rakhine State. The military responded with massive force, and the end result was more than 800,000 people being displaced from Rakhine State and crossing the border into Bangladesh and becoming refugees. It's hard to get accurate estimates of how many people were killed, but I think around 20,000 is a genuine, sort of generally accepted number at this point. So it was an extreme situation. Also happening in September 2017 on Facebook, you had just an incredible proliferation of hate speech and disinformation regarding the Rohingya population. These are some examples. I picked examples that are in English so you can sort of understand what it's getting at. I think what's interesting in the Myanmar case, in this particular time period in particular, was not so much the extreme nature of the hate speech or the specific incitement to violence, but actually just the sheer quantity of the material that was online. During this period, particularly around September and October in Myanmar, if you average Myanmar person opened up your Facebook feed and scrolled through, you would just find more than half of the content that you were looking at was related to this topic, and all coming very much from the same perspective, and a lot of these types of memes and disinformation. This one in the middle is a picture taken from it's from the revolution in Bangladesh and has been repurposed. So there was a lot of that type of stuff as well. And then this message was also circulating. So the violence kicked off on August 25th. And what we saw is, as soon as the violence started, and arguably before the violence started, there was this massive surge in the online hate speech and sort of dangerous content. This was in the first 2 weeks of September, or the first week of September. These messages were circulated around Myanmar. What these are is the same message, essentially, with different versions targeting the Muslim community and the Buddhist community. And saying that on September the 11th, there was going to be violence perpetrated by the other community against members of the target community. The translation here is a bit funny, but they're essentially worded exactly the same way, except targeting the two different groups. And they circulated extremely widely on Facebook Messenger. So at that point, we'll kind of pause what bad happened in Myanmar and move on towards some steps that were made towards a kind of limited and partial accountability. At least in the sense that people know about what happened in Myanmar and we're all talking about it. So this was in late March 2018. So just over a year ago, almost exactly. Mark Zuckerberg did an interview for a podcast for Vox, and during that interview, it was the first time that he'd ever been asked specifically about Myanmar, and he said that Facebook systems had detected a particular incident, and he described the Facebook Messenger incident that I just showed, and said that Facebook systems had detected it and they'd been able to deal with it. In actual fact, Facebook systems hadn't detected it. It had been detected by local civil society in Myanmar who were working full-time trying to monitor Facebook because they were concerned, obviously, about the danger that was presented by the content that was circulated. The civil society groups not only were the ones that detected it, but they tried to get Facebook's attention in order to get it removed. There was no report function in Facebook Messenger at that point, so the only way that they were able to contact Facebook was through back channels. Fortunately, someone happened to have the email address of someone from Facebook in Singapore, and they were able to get it raised, and eventually it was removed. But not before there were actually several violent incidents related to the messenger. So let's just say that Mark Zuckerberg misspoke. The responsible civil society organisations wrote an open letter. The timing was really incredible. So the reason why Mark Zuckerberg was giving this interview in the first place was that he was on a publicity tour because he was about to testify before Congress the following week. So the open letter wound up on the front page of the New York Times, and the civil society groups were able to actually brief senators that were taking part, and Myanmar wound up being the only country other than America that was mentioned during those hearings. And actually this picture is a picture of the Muslim journalist that we showed earlier. So Mark Zuckerberg was asked about why this type of content couldn't be taken down within a specific time frame, and was asked to commit to removing this type of content within 24 hours, which he kind of did, depending on where you put the punctuation in his sentence that he responded to. He said, yes, we are working on this, so, we'll see. moving forward, those civil society organisations that were responsible for the open letter, writing that letter was a real catalyst. They'd already been working closely and comparing notes, but they were able then to actually come together and create a unified front. So there's now the Myanmar Tech Accountability Network, and then this Next Billions Coalition is bringing in civil society groups that are doing monitoring of dangerous content on Facebook and other internet platforms in a wide variety of countries, including India and Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nigeria, all the types of places where this work is needed. But the really critical thing that they're doing is monitoring, in this case Facebook, not for dangerous content on the platform, which is what they've traditionally done. They're still doing that, but they're reporting it to Facebook through the in-platform tools, which is how Facebook finds out about this content. And then they're monitoring Facebook's response times and monitoring the accuracy of whether things get removed. So they've kind of flipped the process and are now using this to try and set some benchmarks for Facebook's performance in removing the content, which I think is, when we talk about accountability, is an interesting starting point. Facebook has a public commitment to removing this type of content, but in countries like Myanmar, they fail to meet that commitment. So this is a way to try and hold them to it. Just to sort of finish off the story, so in October last year, this was an article by Paul Moser in the New York Times, which showed what a lot of people had suspected or kind of known for a long time, but this confirmed it publicly, that the Myanmar military was behind a lot of the content that we'd seen on Facebook. They actually had a troll factory, essentially, with according to these reports, at least up to 700 people working in it at any one time, creating memes and pumping them out and making them go viral through manipulation. And actually, again, according to this report, the messages which Mark Zuckerberg claimed to have detected actually came from this military troll factory. So it's a very important piece of reporting. Following this sort of intense public scrutiny regarding Myanmar, we have seen a lot of changes from Facebook, primarily in terms of engagement with civil society and local actors. Up until that point, they had already been warned on at least 5 occasions, including in person by people from Myanmar at Menlo Park, about the risks of, specifically the risks of genocide happening as a result of hate speech on the platform. But nothing much really seemed to change. At the time of the attacks in September 2017, according to a Reuters investigation led by Steve Stecklow, they had only, I think, between 4 and 6 Myanmar language content reviewers working at that point for around 15 million Myanmar language users. So now at the end of 18, they've increased that number to, at the end of 2018, they've increased that number to 100, which I think is still inadequate, but is obviously a big change. They've recruited some Myanmar language policy speakers. So we have seen some differences. The most important thing that they've done is remove disinformation networks from the platform and actually ban some very prominent figures, including the Commander-in-Chief of the Myanmar military. And these figures had been using Facebook as their sort of personal platform to release information. So it's a drop in the ocean, but it is quite good.
Well, even though it's still insufficient, which I completely agree with, it's 100 monitors for that country, which I think is probably way more than they have in most other countries where they don't have a big advertising market base, where they're not making a lot of money. Yeah,
absolutely. I think when you, it's hard to know to make a clear comparison because there's so little transparency around the content moderation from Facebook. But definitely if you look at comparable markets for them in terms of user base and advertising revenue, I think Myanmar is punching well above its weight in terms of the attention that it's getting from Facebook. And I think that's pretty clearly directly attributable to the public scrutiny that they had. You could argue that it was attributable to the fact that there was a genocide in Myanmar, but I wouldn't make that argument, actually. And that's the end.
So that's the story that we have to bring to you from Myanmar, but I want to hear some reactions from our respondents. First, Margaret, who has a lot of experience dealing with disinformation and other malicious content on social media. I mean, from your experience, Margaret, what can you tell us? Is this a replicable experience? Is this a one-off that we were fortunate to have, but we shouldn't expect to see again? What are your thoughts?
Unfortunately, I think it's the latter rather than the former, and I'm speaking probably as a resident cynic, given my almost 20 years experience reporting as a journalist from the former Soviet Union, Central Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa mostly. I'm quite struck and frankly like amazed at the tremendous positive result that the Burmese civil society activists have been able to have, and I definitely tip my hat to them. I find that one of the biggest changes over the last 15 years or so, let's even say the last 8 years or so, that when I was covering the Arab Spring revolutions, for example, still there was a widespread belief among civil society members, citizens at large, and journalists that the internet and social media platforms were a safe space, and they were areas in which that you could both coalesce like-minded people and amplify your own positive, progressive message. Within the Arab Spring, in Egypt specifically, Tunisia and Yemen, other places, social media became a place for these activists to be able to outfox the authoritarian governments that they were trying to bring down, because the authoritarian governments had no idea, really, the power of the internet and media platforms at that time. The world has changed, in part because Western tech companies have helped those authoritarian governments come past that hurdle, and now they are, in some ways, the leading purchasers and purveyors of authoritarian technology. I was at a panel earlier this morning where I was reminded that Facebook actually worked with the Indian leader Narendra Modi in order to help him be able to amplify his party's message on Facebook and use social media more effectively. That hasn't turned out well if you're a dissident or an investigative journalist in India right now. So I'm struck by two things. One is that in places where social media companies like Facebook and Twitter have big business models, outside of the, let's say, the developed economies, places like the Philippines, places like Saudi Arabia, places like Nigeria, all these places to them are great for business. Social media penetration is extremely high, but at the same time, there really aren't the same institutional tools that civil activists can use in order to protect their rights or even their own physical safety. Rule of law is basically non-existent in Saudi Arabia, right? At the same time, the state runs troll farms that can both be a physical threat to dissidents as well as physical threats to people outside of their own country, as we know from Jamal Khashoggi. So when you look at the profit motive of companies like Facebook or like Twitter, there's got to be other tools in which civil society activists or just general citizens can use in order to affect what we might all consider bad behavior, but Facebook and Twitter have been very reluctant and very slow to move against. So there is quite a challenge ahead for people in other countries in order to find those pressure points for big social media and big tech to help keep their democracies and their selves safe from harm.
Thank you, Margaret. So I also want to hear from Emma on the rule of law regulatory approaches to dealing with social media and hate speech on the internet, which you have a lot to say about.
Yes, so I was going to start by saying that even in well, what is a usually stable democracy like the UK with robust institutions, it's not easy to hold Facebook to account or the other big tech companies. And recently, a parliamentary committee released the report of its inquiry into disinformation and fake news. And they ended up just being furious with Facebook's interactions with them. And the chair ended up with, wrote that Facebook deliberately sought to frustrate our work. And the report says that companies like Facebook behaved like digital gangsters in the last few years. I mean, the report covers things like, disinformation, electoral interference, and data privacy issues. And so the committee had summoned invited Mark Zuckerberg to appear on more than one occasion, and he wouldn't come, he wouldn't appear by Skype, even when there was an international committee from, I think, 8 different countries, and he wouldn't come, he sent a representative. And so, I think it is very, very difficult to try and hold these companies to account or make any difference. And I mean, there's been quite a lot reported recently about how, the model of a company like Facebook or YouTube, it's built on engagement, and it's just not in their interest to remove content until there's some kind of massive public outcry or until they're actually forced to. There's a recent piece that came out in the last few days in Bloomberg, I think, about YouTube, which is very interesting in that area. And I mean, in the UK, we are currently waiting for the government to publish its plans to legislate on online harms, which will effectively be plans to introduce some kind of social media regulation. So we're waiting for that in the next couple of weeks. And I mean, in other countries, I imagine a lot of people know about the law in Germany, which requires platforms to take down content that is obviously illegal within 24 hours or face up to 50 million euros fine. And this has led to a big increase in the number of moderators. So now apparently 1 in 6 Facebook moderators are working on German content, but we don't know if the right content is being removed. There's been a lot of criticism about the risk of over-censorship in this kind of case, because obviously tech companies want to be on the safe side, so maybe they're just taking things down that actually aren't obviously illegal, and it's also, the terms aren't clearly defined. And so there's a sort of lack of transparency, which makes things very hard. A couple of cases that I think are interesting of things that have sort of changed recently. So in the UK, there was it was a couple of years ago, a young teenager committed suicide, and her father said that Instagram helped kill my daughter. And this was widely reported, and Instagram has committed to removing graphic images of self-harm because what her parents had found that she had been looking on Instagram at ways to self-harm. And so, I think this was in February, and then a month later, apparently there was still a lot of content on there that the UK children's charity, NSPCC, said could still be very harmful. So, Instagram is committed to doing this, but whether it's actually, at what rate it's actually happening, we don't know. And I do think that harm to children is kind of a soft spot where it's easier to put pressure on companies like this. Another example, not UK specific, but we talked about was on Pinterest has responded to, and a study showed that 75% of pins on Pinterest about vaccinations were negative, were anti-vaccination. And because Pinterest didn't really know how to deal with this, they've built a sort of blacklist of search terms. So now, if you search vaccines or vaccinations on Pinterest, you just don't get any results. So that's been their way of addressing that. And so that obviously came as a result of, of public pressure, and there was actually, there was a study, a scientific study done showing this 75% figure. So that's something I think that's important as well, is actually there being, in terms of, how to make change, is to actually have, research and evidence on these issues. And just going back to, and yeah, I think just on the vaccine issue, the World Health Organization has listed vaccine hesitancy, reluctance to vaccinate, as one of the top 10 global health threats in 2019. So this is really sort of, I suppose there's this real international pressure, and the tech companies feel, obliged to do something. And yes, I would agree that, it's very challenging for anybody, civil society or governments, to get stuff done. But to be a little bit more optimistic, I would say that the time is now, and there's been so much coverage of these issues that I think it's a much better time to try and, force people's hand, as opposed to, a couple of years ago, when I think it would have been much harder. So.
Thank you, Emma. So now you have the chance to tell us how hopeful you feel after the somewhat kind of positive story, maybe hopeful a little bit, and then the splash of really cold water from Margaret, and then the splash of pretty cold but not quite as cold water from Emma. So again, if you're interested, please log in and put yourself on the spectrum. How positive and hopeful are you about fixing hate speech and disinformation on social media, or how negative are you? And while we do that, I'm gonna try to see if we have any stories from the audience. If anybody has stories of accountability or changes of behavior by social networks that they've seen in the countries where they work or where they live that weren't discussed here and maybe aren't widely known. Has anybody got a story like that they would like to share? Please.
Can I ask a question now? Okay.
It's not like a permission thing. Tell your story, and then if you want to ask a question.
Yeah, my story is completely different, like unrelated to my question. But the story is just that I'm a student who studies journalism in Denmark. So there we've noticed that on TV, Danish national TV, they have these two channels that they're forced to watch because that's all that they have. So they show stuff that is against immigrants. They are trying to convince the citizens to see why having immigrants around are inconvenient for them. So I guess that's one story that would be related. But I have a question to the panel about what, can you hear me? Yes, so I have a question. So you were talking about how Mark Zuckerberg and the people who own Facebook and YouTube are somehow responsible for the content that's posted on their websites, on their companies. But the thing is, how can we expect Mark Zuckerberg to take a side if, if he had to take a side and delete someone's post, wouldn't that make him a digital gangster? Because then he is violating somebody else's right to freedom of expression. And at the same time, when all these are really pressing issues, we have so much more of really dark and terrorizing content on like the dark web of child pornography, especially that the new Netflix documentary shed so much light on it. And instead of focusing on things like that, which was actually started by the US government, we choose to focus on Facebook. And I mean, what do you have to say about that? Don't you think we have bigger fish to fry?
What do you say about it? You guys are in the front. I don't have to.
I would say that there are no bigger fish to fry right now in terms of how citizens want to protect their societies and their democracies from misinformation. There are few to no people that I know, whether I'm talking about my nieces who are 19 years old or 25 years old to, you know, my aunts and my mother, there's no one that I know who surfs the dark web regularly. So that is a niche that obviously needs to be controlled, and in most countries, that's what the police and law enforcement are trying to do. We don't have police and law enforcement who are regulating Facebook and other open social media platforms. In most of the countries, I expect, where we live, you know, big tech companies have been allowed to define themselves as just that, tech companies instead of publishers. And while they have been decimating the traditional journalism model by stealing advertisers and becoming publishing platforms for news, they have absolutely no legal liability for the news that's being published on their sites. That should change. If Facebook, or if Twitter had to account for everything that was published by verified users, they would actually have to, for you know, penalty of both fines or imprisonment, have to take down things that are false quicker than they're doing now. If Facebook had to have the same legal liabilities as the Wall Street Journal, they would also have to be much more responsible. They'd have to have editors who are editing and copy editors who are fact-checking. And right now, the atmosphere with tech companies is that we are responding to things that are starting to blow up in our faces. Corporate social responsibility members of their C-suites say that we have to do a little bit, let's ameliorate the public outcry about these things, but they're not actually tackling the root of all of this, which is that people around the world now are using social media platforms as a place where they're consuming their news more than they are traditional media companies. And that should come with some responsibility that so far to date, the big tech companies aren't showing.
Sorry, just to add, I think that you're right on the freedom of expression issue. I think it is very difficult, you know, to draw the line, and you obviously, you know, don't want to be restricting most people's freedom of expression. And I think, you know, something like the law in Germany is looking at taking down content which is illegal, and Germany has very strict hate speech laws. And I don't know about whether the content in Myanmar was illegal. But
no, I mean, you can't, in a country like Myanmar, where the government's the ones that are doing it, you can't kind of rely on regulation to protect you.
But was there a hate law in anti-hate law?
No, but they're going to pass one. Yeah.
Okay. And that's a big thing. I mean, with the UK legislation, which the government is going to propose, is going to, so it's obviously there is content which is already illegal. UK does also have hate speech laws, not as strict as Germany's, but they're also looking, yes, they're going to be looking at harmful content, and that is a very controversial issue. Because, you know, the story I mentioned about Instagram saying it will take down graphic images of self-harm, you know, you could argue that it's very important for people to be able to share their stories and share these issues. And so I think it is really hard for the social networks to try and, you know, make these decisions about, is this something that's, you know, overall, you know, beneficial or not? It's not clear cut, and. I mean, I think it's a huge, huge challenge, because obviously the freedom of expression which people have on these social networks is also a really amazing thing, and I think that there's so much good that comes out of it as well. So I think that's something that people have to think really hard about. But things like incitement to violence are pretty clear. No, can be pretty clear now.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, your question, do we really want Facebook or Google, YouTube, these types of platforms to be the ones that are the kind of arbiters of what's right and what's not right? You know, do we want them to be the ones making the decision about what people can see and what they can't see? You know, I think the answer to that is probably almost certainly no. But that's not what's going on. I mean, they are the arbiters of what we can see. They make decisions on that constantly. Facebook removes millions of pieces of content a day. Every single piece of content that you see on Facebook has been algorithmically ranked in a way that has complete lack of transparency. they're able not just, and they regularly do, not just remove content, but play with it so that it doesn't get up-ranked in the algorithm, so that it stays online, but fewer people see it. But there's no way for you to know if that's been happening to your content, or if you're looking at something that other people aren't seeing because Facebook decided that they didn't want people to see it. That's the status quo now. They make these decisions. They have their own sets of guidelines where regulations aren't in place. With Facebook, they call them the community standards, but every platform has some set of rules. I think we can argue around the details of the rules quite a lot, but the point is that they make these decisions. They have a set of rules that their users expect them to abide by. I think we can have a reasonable expectation that they should make the right decisions, that they should get it right. And I think that that's where journalists and civil society can play a role, is to check that they are getting it right.
I would add one more thing there, which is that in addition to Facebook, Twitter, and every one of these companies already making these decisions through their algorithms, there isn't a fair fight right now when it comes to journalists and civil society versus states. I used to be the bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal in Turkey. The Turkish government would slap an injunction against Twitter if Twitter didn't immediately move within 2 hours, if not 30 minutes, to take down tweets and individual posts. If a civil society actor went to court to try and get that same injunction put into place, guess what? A judge wouldn't rule on it for days, if at all. So within that kind of unfair playing ground, something has to happen in order to help regular citizens take back some modicum of power in their own societies.
I was actually in the Republic of Georgia last week, which has embedded in the Constitution is the right to free expression, and it actually has a quite liberal constitution for a country in the former Soviet Union. But there, the parliament is considering a hate speech law, which should basically be on the German model, and they say that, well, we are in the European Union Association Agreement process, and we need to be up to European standards, and so a slightly repressive, or maybe like repressive curious government is cherry-picking the things that they like out of different European legislations to try to put them into play there, but we'll see where that goes. I saw another question in the audience, or comment.
I wanted to, it's Sam Gregory from Witness, we're a human rights group. Hey, Rafiq. So I wanted to put out an example and then kind of a question about how we actually triangulate between the problems here. So the example is one that we've been grappling with, as well as many other groups, including particularly Syrian Archive, who Hadi from Syrian Archive is here, I'm not sure if he's here in the room, which is the takedowns of videos of war crimes content from Syria, which we see in multiple locations, that this is the critical evidence. When YouTube instituted a series of algorithmic changes, how they monitored content, we lost, within a matter of overnight to a few days, over 100,000 videos. And so we've been pushing back on that and trying to get videos restored. And so some modicums of success in videos restored, but the reason I wanted to put it on the table is I think it goes to the heart of the problem with how we want to solve this, because the tech companies come back to us and say AI is the solution, but it's not the solution. And they're right about that, right? We know that AI is not working to do this type of stuff. It doesn't work for hate speech. If we stick it to the other corner, we're asking more humans to look at horrible things all the time, right? That's the other corner of the triangle. Or we're saying governments regulate this in a way that will be abused by these repressive, curious governments, right? Because Singapore has a regulation coming up. So given that we dislike every corner of the triangle, but we do want to protect freedom of expression, particularly people who are marginalized or facing human rights violations, what should we actually be pushing for?
While you think, I'll put another comment.
Well, I would say that, I mean, you can probably tell by my accent, I'm American, so I would take a capitalistic approach to this, as in interested American. Companies have the right to make money, but they don't have the right to make money irresponsibly. And well thought out regulation keeps us all with safe drinking water and without nuclear waste being dumped in our backyards. You know, there are ways in which companies can do their work, and the social and civic expectations of the way they do their work also informs them about the parameters of that work. So there needs to be outrage, there needs to be sustained outrage, even in developed economies, for those companies and our legislators to make sure that those companies act responsibly. I don't know if anyone in this room, you know, would disagree that there needs to be some sort of limits placed right now on the way that social media platforms and companies operate. This isn't a global response. This has to take place, you know, I think at a local legislature, whether that's America or Germany or Turkey. And when tech companies leave it to citizens to try and make those parameters for them, it's going to be more antagonistic than if tech companies actually did something proactive that gets to the root of the problem. I go back once again to a very simple and elegant solution, which is if social media companies who are making money off of distributing news would have to accept the liabilities of other publishers in that same country they're working in, they would, I think, start automatically changing their behavior. That's not a regulation. That's just working within the framework of other people within the industry. And the industry is news and news distribution.
I'd like to ask a question about, oh, are you done?
Oh, I was just going to just add one more thing. I think, I mean, I think you're completely right. And I think actually that the tech companies use this kind of triangle against us in that, you know, even people who we all agree that we're trying to find a solution to this problem, we all disagree with each other enough that it allows the platforms to just keep on doing whatever they want to do anyway. I feel like a starting point, and maybe something that we can all agree on and push towards, is transparency. You know, I think that regardless of the particular issue that you're looking at, it's very difficult to make an informed recommendation to how the platforms have to deal with it themselves, because they're the only ones that are able to do so. And as an outsider, you can't say what they should do without knowing, you know, what's going on behind the curtain. I think obviously they're businesses, they have privacy concerns for their users. Like, there is a limit to how much transparency there will be, but I think that we can reach a point where there is more transparency and you know, find specific data points that we can hold them to be transparent about, and then, you know, build towards some accountability on that.
If you are interested in playing God for 1 minute, and if there's one thing you could change in Facebook, please go ahead and submit it to the poll. We're going to take one more question, then we're going to end a little bit early. If you have anything else you want to speak with us about, please come up to the panel. Yes.
Yes, Joyce Barnathan, International Center for Journalists. I want to talk about that example of that seemed to be a success story on vaccines, which was 70% of the information was bad.
We actually covered this, I think, just before you came in, on vaccinations, and they removed the search term.
That's what I heard that. What I'm asking about is a vacuum, no information, a success story or not? And to me, there's something also very, very scary about the fact that we just wiped vaccines off of a platform. And I feel uncomfortable calling that a success, even though I understand that more than half the information was false. So I'd just like to get your reaction to that.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that that was a success story, but I would say that was it was a response, to a study. It was an attempt to do something about it. I agree with you, and it is weird. I tried it myself, searching for something. I mean, I wouldn't use Pinterest in that way anyway, but, it's weird when you search for something and it says, we have no results for this term. I mean, they say the reason that they did it was because obviously, scientists aren't producing, a ready stream of data about the effectiveness of vaccines because, it's established facts. So the problem was that there was this, what I think is called a data void. So yeah, all the information that was coming up was anti-vaccination. And they were so concerned about spreading this that that was the only thing they felt they could do. I wouldn't say it's the best response. But I suppose it was a response. And I thought it was interesting that it was the result of, this was sort of a study, scientific study was done, and this was, the way they responded. And obviously there's plenty of other, ways that networks are responding, and I think that Facebook is doing various complicated things, and things like not recommending groups in search results. And one thing, it's on another case, not vaccinations, but something that YouTube just did for this, it's quite prominent, far-right activist in the UK, was he's been banned on Facebook and maybe Instagram, but YouTube decided he still has his channel, but it doesn't come up any recommendations. It can't be advertised against. It's just there, but it's much harder to find. Which I suppose if you don't want to ban something outright, which obviously is understandable, maybe that's a better way to do it. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a success story. So.
I maybe would say that it is, just because Pinterest is not in the business of brokering information about things like that. If it's supposed to be a platform for cooking photos, then maybe that's what it should remain, and they should get out of the business of other things that aren't what the main purpose of the platform was. But what do you think, Margaret?
Well, I think if people who use Pinterest are also coming to Pinterest for public health information, then Pinterest should do something a little bit more proactive. Erase the fake news, erase the fake photos, and then find a verified, a verified partner in the health community. In America, there's the Center for Disease Control. Go to a local, hospital. Have the hospital pay you to put their link on your page instead. That's a money-making win for Pinterest. You get another advertising source, and the people who are coming to Pinterest for that information actually have verified information to look at. I think that there's lots of creative ways to do this, and I think the bigger takeaway is that social media companies aren't doing enough, but again, when you live in a democratic society, there are lots of different members and sectors of society who contribute to that democracy. I think that public health officials have to be more proactive as well, coming to the places where fake news is and trying to get them, the tech companies themselves, to work with them to help correct that misinformation.
Thanks. We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining. If you have another question, just come up to the front. And that's it. Thank you.